Richard Sever. He's now an assistant director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press in New York, and as I said, a co-founder of the preprint server bioRxiv. And he is, like many of us, a molecular biologist by training, where he did his PhD at the University of Cambridge, and later moved on to the editorial field, where he served as an editor at Current Opinion in Cell Biology and Trends in Biochemical Sciences, before becoming an executive director or editor at Journal of Cell Science. And later on, he moved to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. And so the use of preprints has become widespread in the field of biology after the launch of bioRxiv, and it's been a great initiative to communicate science at a much higher speed than before, making it widely accessible. And so we are very grateful to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to your talk, and the stage is all yours.
Well, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. I very much hoped to be in Germany with you, but unfortunately that's not the case, but I think we're all getting used to communicating remotely. So I'm going to talk about primarily about bioRxiv and medRxiv today, but I just wanted to start off by making the point that these initiatives come out of Cold Spring Harbor Lab. We're an academic research institute on the North Shore of Long Island in New York, with 600 scientific staff, programs in molecular biology, cancer, neuroscience, plant biology, and genomics. But as well as being a research institute, we've actually got a much longer history of scientific communication. In fact, the first courses held at Cold Spring Harbor go back more than 100 years. And since then, in the intervening decades, we've done a number of things. We have our own conference program, which like this meeting, is now operating remotely for the most part. We have a graduate school. We do residential lab and lecture courses at the lab. We run the DNA Learning Center that teaches high school kids about molecular biology in New York, in New York City, and in Long Island. And also we have a sort of dissemination program. We've been publishing books and journals for many years, and a number of you may have come across molecular cloning, for example, which is often sort of referred to as the Bible of molecular biology. But most recently, we've gotten involved in building preprint servers to serve the biomedical community. And really, here's some background to why. So this slide is one that I show the students at Cold Spring Harbor every year, and it describes the traditional publication process at a journal. Essentially, what happens is an author submits a paper to a journal, and if it's a good journal, then about 50% of the time, the paper will be rejected and the author has to go to another journal. If they're lucky enough to submit a paper that the editor is interested in, they then run the gauntlet of the referees. So 2 or 3 weeks later, ideally, they will get reports back from the referees. The editor will look at the referee reports, and a lot of the time they will reject the paper and the author has to start again. If they're lucky enough that the editor is still interested, then the most common decision is a revision request. The paper is sent back to the author, and they have to spend several months doing new experiments. And ultimately, this entire process tends to take around a year before the paper is finally accepted and published. And only then can it actually be read by anyone. And in many cases, the paper is paywalled, so most people can't read it. So the question is, in the age of the web, whether this is the right way to do things. And I think what I'll argue today is that it isn't. And the better way to do things is to decouple the process of dissemination from the process of certification by sharing the paper first as a preprint before it undergoes peer review. And just to be clear what I mean by preprint, because some people use them in different ways, what I mean is an unpublished manuscript that is basically the author's version that has not been through peer review and been accepted by a journal. And there's a precedent for this in physics. The archive was established in 1991 and now hosts more than 1 million preprints. This is predominantly in areas of math, physics, and computational computational science. So we decided in 2013 to try and bring this approach to the biological sciences by launching bioRxiv. bioRxiv launched in 2013, as I say. It was done with the blessing of arXiv. It's a non-profit service focusing primarily on biology. It's all entirely free, and it's funded by Cosmin Harbor Lab and the Chen Zuckerberg Initiative. And this proved to be somewhat prescient in that shortly after we launched bioRxiv, a whole bunch of additional, largely discipline-specific non-profit preprint servers were launched. So we got ChemArchive in chemistry, AgriChive, SociArchive, SciArchive, and we've got to the point where for many sub-disciplines, there is now an equivalent Chive of some sorts. And we ourselves followed this up in 2019 by launching medRxiv. This was a partnership between Cold Spring Harbor, BMJ, and Yale. And the distinction here was really that we felt for clinical work, there were additional ethics considerations and additional concerns about dissemination of clinical information that meant that we should have a separate server with a slightly different process. So we have additional declarations required of authors and an enhanced screening process. So why post a preprint? Why post a preprint from the author's point of view? Well, I think the main thing is the rapid transmission of results. You can make it available immediately at the timing of your choice, rather than waiting on the stochasticity of journal dissemination. It's also an opportunity to get pre-publication feedback on your work, and there are great examples like this one shown in a tweet from Sri Kasuri of people who've posted work as a preprint, gotten really good feedback that's helped them improve the paper, and then actually it's ultimately made their life easier when they've gone to a journal. It's also a way to get visibility for your work, particularly for early career scientists. So frequently, if you think of like fellowships of a time course of about 3 years, if you're sitting trying to get your paper into Cell for 2 years, those two kind of timescales are incompatible. If you post a preprint, you can get your work out there, get exposure, and make it immediately available to grant, hiring, and tenure committees. And there are cases like Nikolai Slavov's at Northeastern, where he got his tenure track job, on the basis of posting a preprint on bioRxiv, and the final paper only appeared in Cell reports after he was already installed as a PI. So this curve, if you look at the blue plot, that shows the submission to publication times for journals in PubMed, and it really makes the point about this acceleration of publication that bioRxiv provides. You see the blue plot, the median there is about 7 months to get into a journal, but the range goes out beyond 2 years. By contrast, bioRxiv is typically a bioRxiv preprint typically available in 24 to 48 hours. And I said beyond 3 years. I mean, this really does happen. This is a recent paper in Nature, published in 2019, but it was originally submitted almost 5 years before, and that was 5 years when people couldn't read the work and people couldn't begin to build on it. This is a timeline of some recent work by a former colleague of mine, Mike Fagan, who now has his own lab in upstate New York, and it really illustrates what this means to an individual PI. So here he describes the timeline of finding some work on bioRxiv that he heard about via Twitter midway through 2017. He reached out to the author of the work, and they started talking, set up a collaboration, and began in the fall of 2017 setting up a whole bunch of new experiments. Come January of 2018, those experiments were done. They were harvesting cells, doing DNA analysis, and so the follow-up work was complete in January. And in January, almost within the same week, the paper that he first read in June of the previous year was finally published in a journal. So essentially, he had a 7-month head start on his research. And for somebody who's a tenure track individual, you normally have five years to really make a go of it. So a 7-month head start is really considerable. And I think what we think of in terms of the big picture is thinking about the aggregate of all those 7 months. If everybody was to do this, what does that time saving translate to in terms of science? And Steve Quake at the BioHub in San Francisco has done some back of envelope calculations suggesting that if everyone were to post a preprint, that aggregate time saving could actually speed up science 5-fold over a period of 10 years, which I think is interesting. And anybody who wants to look at this logic should go and check out this YouTube video. I think now in medicine, and particularly in the midst of a pandemic, this time saving is becoming acutely apparent. When you look at the 2003 SARS epidemic, 93% of the papers that came out were published after the epidemic was over. By the 2016 Zika epidemic, you're beginning to see preprints appear on bioRxiv with new data in the midst of the epidemic. And by the time we got to 2020 in the COVID-19 pandemic, we've now had more than 8,000 preprints on bioRxiv and medRxiv, presenting new data about COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is really incredible and really making a big difference. There's incredible work like the structure of the virus, the early epidemiological observations coming out of China, things like the recovery trial showing the importance of the effectiveness of dexamethasone, and a whole bunch of in vitro studies with new potential drug targets. So this kind of explains the workflow and how it works on bioRxiv and medRxiv. Essentially, an author submits a paper. It gets some administrative checks to check that it looks like a paper. There's an automated plagiarism check. And then it goes to an affiliate pool, which is basically scientists who have a quick look at the paper and ascertain that it actually is science, it is a research article. And this is just a very, very coarse filter, and a small number of papers are escalated to leadership if they're concerned that they might contain dangerous information. And so these are some of the things that we look for in this screen. We're looking for something that's not science, it's pseudoscience, is there plagiarism, are there ethical issues with it because a patient's identity is revealed? Are there ways in which it could be harmful to the public? Is it, does it dispute vaccine safety? Is it dual use research, disease transmission? Does it argue that HIV is not caused by sex, for example, or cigarettes don't cause cancer? That type of thing. But this is a very, very small number of papers fail this test, and it's important that this is just a loose screen. This is not peer review. We're not trying to establish whether or not the paper is correct or not. So the papers that are posted, it's just the author's PDF. There's no typesetting, but we do add full text HTML later. When the manuscript goes online, it's date stamped for a priority stamp, and it's given a DOI so it can be cited. The authors get to choose the subject category, define whether the article is new or confirmatory or contradictory results. We want to provide a home for reproducibility studies as well. And you can post a revised version at any time, which is very different from the journal, and along with a version note saying what's different about the work from the previous version. The papers are all indexed by Google Scholar, Google, Microsoft Academic, and a variety of other discovery tools. There's metrics to show how often they're being used. We have a commenting section, and we provide links to published versions when the paper finally appears in the journal, as well as links to discussions taking place elsewhere on the web. And all the content's archived through Portico, so that's a long-term archiving source. So if anything were to happen to bioRxiv or medRxiv, the information's there for the long term. This is just a quick look at what the site looks like. You can see it's just a big list of papers in different subject areas highlighted on the right. This is an individual paper. You can see the abstract, the DOI, and the download link are highlighted. This is one of those PDFs, a paper from Jennifer Doudna. So as you can see, this is just the paper as she wrote it in Word or whatever, but we do convert them to HTML as shown here, so you have inline figures in the HTML. The history tab shows all the different versions of the paper. You can go back and see an earlier version of the paper. As I said, there's a revision summary there, so you can see what is new about the new version of the paper. The metrics tab shows how often the paper's been downloaded, how often it's been tweeted in social media, etc. For I think authors like this information. I won't comment on how valuable it is. And as I said, we link to the published version very prominently when that appears. So this article appeared in Nature, so there's a big red link to Nature when the paper finally appears there. And as I said, I'll talk a little bit about this later. We have links below the article to online conversations occurring about them. So how are we doing? This is the growth of bioRxiv over the past 7 years. We're coming up to about 100,000 papers in total. The dark blue bars show the monthly posts, which are about 3,500 per month. So we're getting about 130 a day, something like that at this point. And this is medRxiv growth. And you can see we launched in June of last year, and it sort of followed the early days of bioRxiv for a while up until January. And then in January, around mid-January, the world became aware of COVID-19, and we got an explosion in COVID-19 submissions, to the point that we're now getting almost as many papers on medRxiv every day as we are getting papers on bioRxiv. So as I said, 100,000 papers on bioRxiv, 10,000 on medRxiv. About 30% of these papers are revised, and we're getting around 30 million, I think was the peak of views of bioRxiv and medRxiv per month. More than 70% of the papers go on to be published in journals. That figure is calculated after a couple of years, but I think it shows that these are good papers. This isn't a load of nonsense. This is papers that will ultimately end up in journals. The figure is probably a little bit higher than 70% because we do this through title matching after 2 years, and so sometimes the titles change too much for us to identify them, and of course after 2 years some of them could still be in revision of a journal. Since the launch of bioRxiv, we've seen a lot of progress among biologists. More and more biologists are posting, reading and citing preprints. We're now at the point where almost every basic biology journal is happy for an author to post a preprint. Funders are allowing preprints to be cited in grants. Hiring committees, I just saw Rockefeller encouraging people to put preprints in their job applications. And we're seeing more recent data being presented at meetings because people have the confidence to post a preprint just before the meeting, so they have essentially put a marker down about their work, so that they're less concerned about talking about very recent data that somebody might sort of steal, so to speak. We like to think of bioRxiv and medRxiv as hubs, that, as well as disseminating information quickly, also create conditions for evolution of the ecosystem, and we want to promote this. So, as I said, we're indexed by people like Google, Google Scholar. We promote discussions online. We promote reproducibility by the confirmatory and contradictory results categories, and we also want to make life easier for people who are going on to peer review venues like journals. So, for example, the J2B and B2J technologies are technologies that we developed that allow people to send papers automatically from bioRxiv to many journals. So now when you submit to bioRxiv, there's a list of about 150 journals, and you can just click on one of these and send your paper over to the journal for consideration. Many of these journals also engage in a thing called J2B, which means if you submit to one of these journals, there's a button that says, do you want to also post your paper on bioRxiv or medRxiv? And if you click that, the paper's immediately put live as a preprint while it's undergoing peer review. Another initiative to encourage early dissemination is Transparent Review and Preprint, or TRIP. eLife, EMBO, and a few others are doing this, and this allows them to post the peer reviews of papers that they are considering alongside the preprint on bioRxiv long before this ends up being published by the journal. I think the other thing that's very interesting is the existence of preprints is encouraging evolution of peer review itself. So we see examples like Prelights, this initiative from the Company of Biologists, which is essentially a news and views for preprints. Pre-review is a kind of way of building journal clubs for early career researchers that allow them to get experience of peer review by peer reviewing preprints that are on bioRxiv. There are then more formal entities like Review Commons and Peer Community In, which are essentially portable peer review initiatives. You can go to Review Commons with your preprint, they will peer review it for you, and then you can take the preprint and the peer reviews to a journal and see whether or not the journal is interested in it. This is very important amid the pandemic, where we're seeing a number of initiatives springing up to provide rapid reviews of COVID-19 information long before a journal could do it. So for the Mount Sinai group here in New York, and the University of Oxford Immunology Network, and the Hopkins Novel Coronavirus Research Compendium are basically doing week by week peer reviews of a number of preprints, just so that people can really help to to help people digest them as this work is coming up so quickly. MIT have formalized this with RRC19, which is actually a brand new journal. And the whole purpose of this journal is to publish reviews of papers that are posted on bioRxiv and medRxiv as preprints. So I think it's interesting when we think about the pandemic and what's happening with peer review, because I think it allows us to think about how peer review may change in a post-pandemic world. And so I think, one of the questions I would ask is when do we do peer review? And I would say that I think in about 99% of cases, the answer is we do it after we've disseminated the paper as a preprint. How do we do peer review? If the paper's been disseminated as a preprint, there's an opportunity to think, well, maybe we don't peer review things all in the same way. Maybe if it's a synthetic biology paper, we do it differently from a biophysics paper. And the fact that the information has been disseminated means that we can potentially take time and think about what's the best way to peer review this information. Who does the peer review is another question. There's lots of talk about reviewer fatigue, but the reality is that the Global South is massively underrepresented in the peer review community, as are early career researchers. So the existence of a preprint and this decoupling of dissemination and peer review maybe will allow us to get more people involved. And then finally, which papers do we peer review? There's always been an argument that there's some number of papers that are only ever read by experts who are perfectly equipped to peer review them themselves. So are there some papers which just you don't peer review? The peer reviewer is the reader. Estimates vary as to what percentage of papers might fall into that category. But I do think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we do need peer review. It's important to signal the trustworthiness of articles, and I think there are various discussions about what peer review is going to look like in the future, and it could be more incremental. And Kathleen Hall-Jameson, myself, Veronique Kierma, and Marshall McNutt posted some ideas about how this might happen in this recent article in PNAS. So finally, I just wanted to acknowledge all the people who've been involved with bioRxiv and medRxiv. It's tempting for people to think that it's just putting stuff on the website, but actually it's a huge amount of work from an incredibly dedicated team. The CSHL preprinting has been working pretty much 24/7 since certainly for this year, but worked incredibly hard on the initiative. We also have a great partnership with the folks at Yale and BMJ who've worked with us on medRxiv. The leadership at Cold Spring Harbor have been fantastically supportive, as have the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, who fund us. We have technology partnerships with Highwire Press in California, Google, and Hypothesis, and great collaborations with PLOS, EMBO, eLife, and a whole bunch of other journals. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this really nice talk. We'll jump straight to the Q&A session, if that's okay with you, and we have lots of questions come in.
Thank you very much.
So I will start with a question that says, can a preprint affect the future publication of a paper by increasing its impact factor?
So you're breaking up a little bit. I can't hear you now.
Can you hear me now? It's also freezing.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Barbara, the co-moderator. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So the questions that we have are, can a preprint affect the future publication of a paper by increasing its impact factor? Asked by Katerina.
So the question is, can it affect the, well, I mean, so the impact factor is a measure of a journal, not a preprint. I guess you mean citations. So there are some studies that suggest that if you post your article as a preprint, you get more citations, and you definitely get more people looking at the article. It's pretty early days now, but I think the idea is that the information is available much earlier. so more people get a chance to look at it twice. So yeah, there are some data from arXiv and bioRxiv suggesting that you do in fact increase the number of citations, but I'm always wary of this because there's lots of confounding variables. So there are some data to suggest that, but it may not turn out to be the case. Of course, once everybody does it, then the distinction would no longer exist.
I will try again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So we have a second question. Since papers on bioRxiv are not peer-reviewed yet and can contain some flaws, from your experience, how long does it take on average until they are identified by the critical community? And are there cases in which the preprint publishing of papers with flawed methodology and misleading or wrong findings can cause any harm?
Well, so I think you have to set this against the background of what happens with journals. I think if you talk to anybody who's been looking at the literature for a long time, particularly somebody like Ivan Orensky, who looks at Retraction Watch, they will say that there are huge numbers of papers in journals that are incorrect, and nobody ever retracts them. The big difference with a preprint is that there's essentially a sign on the preprint saying this may be wrong. So I think in general, that the most important thing is that you have to make your own judgment about them. But that said, there are a number of examples where this does happen. One of the most famous is the so-called uncanny paper on bioRxiv that claims some similarity between HIV and SARS-CoV-2. And actually, within 24 hours, the scientific community had weighed in pretty comprehensively, saying that the paper was not correct, was wrong, and then the authors withdrew it. I mean, that's somewhat unusual. But I think what often happens is that people are more likely just to ignore papers that they think are wrong. There may be some dispute about this. I don't think there's a big difference between preprints and journal articles here. But you can withdraw. It's important. You can withdraw a paper, and there are a number of papers on bioRxiv and medRxiv that the authors withdraw, and this works just like a retraction. The authors say, you know what, I've done some more work, I don't think my findings hold up, and they can submit a withdrawal. So you can still see the paper, but there's a stamp on it saying this has been withdrawn. But as for the accuracy of I think the question was about on average, it's hard to do those things because there's always going to be debates within preprints and within the journal literature as to whether a paper holds up. I don't think there are examples of any really bad instances, and of course there are many examples in journals of very bad instances, like for example the autism MMR paper, which took 10 years to be retracted. So I think you have to make a comparison to what the existing system is, but we definitely need, and this is one of the things that in that article in PNAS I mentioned that we talk about is the hope that preprints can stimulate an evolution of the ecosystem so that we actually get better signals about what papers are right and wrong and where there are questions, but we're definitely not there yet.
Thank you. We have another question. Are there, do you think, options to establish some kind of crowd peer review process outside of, for example, Twitter as an alternative to the classic peer review method?
Yeah, there are. I mean, one of the things, as I said, this decoupling means that people can do those experiments. So there are, there are a few initiatives to do things like this. I suppose in some respects, PubPeer. I don't know if you come. PubPeer is essentially a crowd-based initiative to identify flaws in papers. They have a new system they've set up called periodicals, which would allow people to do this. So I think I think that's definitely something that could be done. I think the challenge will be to persuade authors, readers, and particularly funders of the validity of that process. So I think it's something that a lot of people are talking about. I don't think we're yet at the point where we can point to any specific success stories, but I think it's definitely a possibility.
We also have a question maybe on a little bit more of the sort of career pathway side. Someone asking, how did you get into editing in the first place?
How did I get into editing? Well, I think I'd always wanted to be a journalist or an editor. So what the decision for me after I finished my PhD was whether to be a journalist or an editor. And I did some work with the BBC, and I did some work at Cambridge University Press as sort of a kind of summer job type of thing after the end of my PhD, and then applied for jobs. And I was lucky enough to get the job at Current Opinions, and shortly after that, Trends. I think now it's in some respects it's easier because there's a lot more editorial jobs, but in some respects it's harder because there's a lot more people who want jobs. I think that the key thing is, and I see this when I have to employ people, is that somebody like me who's looking at a candidate wants to see somebody who has evidence that this is what they want to do and has evidence that they can do it. So I think for people who are interested in editorial work, I think the key thing is to get involved in anything that involves writing or organizing analysis of other people's work. So if you write some form of blog, or you are involved in a journal club, or you set up some kind of one person that we employed from Yale had worked on a student newspaper, and all these things that show evidence of interest in the career and show evidence that you can potentially do the type of work that would be called for in editing. And so I had done a little bit of that with my sort of summer job at Cambridge University Press and working with the BBC, and I know that was part of what got me shortlisted for two of the jobs I applied for entry level.
Cool, thank you very much. I think we will stop the Q&A session here, so that one can attend the other talk. And then for any remaining questions, you can all join the speed dating session that starts at 5:10. There you can also ask your questions in person in sort of an informal setting. So I hope that all of you will join. And I want to thank you very much for your talk and for answering all the questions, and see you in a bit.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much. See you then. Bye-bye.